when the bells of Westminster Abbey fell silent on January 5th, 1066, they marked more than just the death of a king. They told for the end of an age, the collapse of a dynasty, and the beginning of a crisis that would tear England apart and reshape its destiny forever. Edward the Confessor, the last great Anglo-Saxon monarch, had breathed his last, leaving behind no heir, no clear succession, and a kingdom on the edge of chaos. But this was no ordinary succession crisis. This was a powder keg of promises, oaths, and ambitions that had been building for decades. Across the English Channel, in the ducal palace of Rouen, William of Normandy sat upon his throne, his eyes fixed westward, on a crown he believed was rightfully his. In the halls of Westminster, Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, prepared to seize what he saw as his destiny. And far to the north, in the fjords of Norway, Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, sharpened his axes and prepared his longships for one final raid that would either make him a legend or see him die trying. 3 men, 3 armies, 1 throne. The stage was set for a year that would witness battles so fierce, marches so grueling, and consequences so profound that they would echo through 1,000 years of history. This is the story of 1066, the year that forged modern England in blood and steel, and made William the Conqueror a name that would never be forgotten. The seeds of this catastrophe had been planted 15 years earlier in the complex web of medieval politics that bound the courts of Europe together. Edward the Confessor, pious and childless, had spent his reign navigating between the competing ambitions of his nobles, the threats from Viking raiders, and the delicate balance of power that kept his kingdom stable. But stability, as Edward would learn too late, was a luxury that medieval kings could rarely afford. The trouble began with the Godwinson family. Earl Godwin of Wessex was the most powerful man in England after the king himself, controlling vast estates and commanding the loyalty of thousands of warriors. His son Harold was cut from the same cloth, a man of iron will and fierce ambition who had proven himself in battle against Welsh raiders and rebellious nobles alike. When Harold's sister Edith married King Edward, it seemed the Godwinsons had positioned themselves perfectly for the future. But in the treacherous world of medieval politics, family ties could be as dangerous as they were valuable. The crisis deepened in 1051 when Edward, perhaps recognizing the growing power of the Godwinsons as a threat to his own authority, made a decision that would haunt England for decades. Desperate to secure his legacy and maintain independence from his overmighty subjects, the king looked across the Channel to his Norman cousins. William, Duke of Normandy, was Edward's distant relative, a proven warrior who had survived assassination attempts and rebellions to forge one of the most formidable military powers in Europe. In a moment that would change history, Edward promised William the English crown. But promises, in the medieval world, were only as strong as the power that backed them. The Anglo-Saxon nobles, led by the Godwinsons, had no intention of accepting a foreign duke as their king. They had their own candidate, their own vision of England's future, and their own armies to make their will reality. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test not just military might, but the very idea of what England was and what it could become. Meanwhile, across the grey waters of the North Sea, another claimant watched and waited. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, was a giant among medieval warriors, standing nearly 7 feet tall, with flowing blonde hair and eyes like winter storms. He was the last of the great Viking kings, a man who had fought in the service of the Byzantine emperor, conquered lands from Russia to the Mediterranean, and returned to Norway with a fortune in gold and a reputation that struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. Harold claimed the English throne through ancient treaties and forgotten oaths, but his real claim was the strength of his sword arm and the loyalty of his fierce Norwegian warriors. The delicate balance that had kept these ambitions in check began to crumble in 1064, when Harold Godwinson made a journey that would seal his fate and England's destiny. Whether by accident or design, Harold found himself shipwrecked on the coast of Normandy, a prisoner of Duke William. What happened next remains one of history's greatest mysteries and most bitter controversies. Norman chroniclers claimed that Harold, overwhelmed by William's hospitality and convinced of the justice of his cause, willingly swore a sacred oath to support the Duke's claim to the English throne. English sources told a different story, painting Harald as a victim of Norman trickery, forced to swear an oath under duress and with his fingers secretly crossed to nullify its power. The truth, lost in the mists of medieval propaganda, mattered less than the perception. William now had what he needed, a legal and moral justification for invasion. Harald had sworn before God and witnesses to support the Norman claim. When he took the English crown for himself, he would not just be a usurper but a perjurer, a breaker of sacred oaths whose very soul was forfeit. In an age when such things mattered more than life itself, this was a weapon more powerful than any sword. As 1065 drew to a close, the political temperature in England reached a fever pitch. King Edward, now in his 60s and increasingly frail, seemed to sense that his end was approaching. The kingdom he had ruled for over 20 years was fracturing along invisible lines of loyalty and ambition. In the north, rebellions flared as local nobles chafed under the authority of Harold's brother Tostig, Earl of Northumbria. The rebels drove Tostig from his lands, forcing him into exile and creating another piece on the deadly chessboard of 1066. Tostig, bitter and humiliated, would soon find his way to the court of Harald Hardrada, adding his local knowledge and burning desire for revenge to the Norwegian king's invasion plans. In Normandy, William's preparations took on an air of holy crusade. The Duke had secured the backing of Pope Alexander II, who blessed his cause and granted him a papal banner to carry into battle. This was no longer just a dynastic dispute but a righteous war, sanctioned by God himself and supported by the greatest military minds of the age. Norman shipyards echoed with the sound of hammers and saws as hundreds of vessels took shape, each one designed to carry horses, men, and the instruments of conquest across the treacherous waters of the English Channel. The scale of William's preparations was staggering by medieval standards. He assembled not just Norman knights but warriors from across northern France, Bretons hungry for land and glory, Flemish mercenaries seasoned by constant warfare, and ambitious younger sons eager to carve out new estates in a conquered kingdom. The logistics alone represented a masterpiece of medieval military planning. 8,000 men, 5,000 horses, countless tons of weapons, armor, and supplies, all had to be organized, transported, and maintained in fighting condition. It was an undertaking that would have challenged the resources of the Roman Empire at its height. As winter gave way to spring in 1066, the three armies began their final preparations. In England, Harold Godwinson marshaled the fyrd, the traditional levy of Anglo-Saxon warriors who formed the backbone of English military power. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers, craftsmen, and merchants who answered their lord's call to arms with whatever weapons they could afford. But at their core were the huscarls, Harold's elite household troops, professional warriors whose two-handed axes had earned a reputation for devastating effectiveness in close combat. The tension was building to a breaking point that would reshape not just England, but the entire trajectory of European history. The summer of 1066 arrived with ominous portents that seemed to warn of the catastrophe to come. Halley's comet blazed across the night sky, its fiery tail stretching like a sword over England. To the superstitious minds of medieval men, this celestial visitor was an omen of death and destruction, a harbinger of dynastic change written in the stars themselves. Chronicles would later record how people gazed upward in terror, whispering prayers and crossing themselves as the comet's baleful light illuminated their faces. But while common folk trembled at heavenly signs, the great players in this deadly game prepared for very earthly warfare. Harald Godwinson, now crowned King of England, faced the impossible task of defending a kingdom under siege from multiple directions. His coronation on January 6th had been swift and decisive, but legitimacy gained through speed could just as quickly be lost through defeat. The crown sat heavy upon his head, weighted not just with gold but with the knowledge that two of Europe's most dangerous warriors were sharpening their blades for his destruction. Harold's position was precarious beyond imagination. To the south, William's invasion fleet gathered like storm clouds on the horizon. Norman spies brought word of the Duke's preparations, tales of ships being built by the hundred and armies drilling on the beaches of Normandy. To the north, Harald Hardrada's dragon-headed longships prowled the coastal waters, their crews singing death songs and polishing their weapons. And somewhere in the shadows moved Tostig, Harold's own brother. Consumed by hatred and thirsting for revenge against the man who had failed to restore him to his northern earldom. The Anglo-Saxon military system, which had served England well for centuries, now revealed its fundamental weakness. The fyrd, the citizen militia that formed the backbone of English defence, could not be kept in the field indefinitely. These were farmers and craftsmen who had crops to tend and trades to practice. They could answer the call to arms for a few weeks, perhaps a few months in times of dire emergency, but they could not remain under arms through an entire campaigning season. Harold found himself caught in a strategic nightmare, forced to guess where the blow would fall while his enemies held the initiative. William, master of psychological warfare, played this game with deadly skill. Throughout the spring and early summer, Norman ships appeared off the English coast only to vanish again, keeping Harold's forces in a constant state of readiness. False alarms drained English resources and frayed nerves. Men stood watch on cliff tops, scanning empty horizons for sails that never came. The Duke understood that the anticipation of invasion could be almost as devastating as invasion itself. Meanwhile, in the fjords of Norway, Harald Hardrada prepared for what he knew would be his final gamble. At nearly 60 years old, the giant king was approaching the twilight of his warrior's career, but his appetite for glory remained undiminished. His court scolds sang of his exploits in distant lands, of battles fought beneath foreign stars and treasures, won with blood and steel. But Harold craved one in the sagas for final victory, one last conquest that would cement his name all time. England, rich and ripe for plucking, beckoned like a golden apple just beyond his grasp. The Norwegian king's preparations were as methodical as William's, but carried out with Viking thoroughness. His longships, sleek predators of the sea, were provisioned for a campaign that might last months. Harold gathered not just Norwegian warriors but Danish mercenaries, Swedish adventurers, and exiled English nobles eager to reclaim their lost estates. His fleet would number over 300 ships, carrying perhaps 8,000 warriors, the largest Viking force assembled in decades. As summer reached its peak, the strategic situation began to crystallize with terrifying clarity. Harold's spies brought word that both invasion fleets were nearly ready, their commanders waiting only for favorable winds and the right moment to strike. The English king faced an impossible choice. If he concentrated his forces against William in the south, Harald Hardrada would fall upon the undefended north like a wolf upon sheep. If he marched north to meet the Norwegian threat, William's Normans would land unopposed and establish an unshakable foothold in southern England. The answer, when it came, would test every aspect of Harold's character as both king and commander. He chose to divide his forces, a decision that military theorists would debate for centuries. The main body of his army, including his precious huscarls, would remain in the south to guard against Norman invasion. A smaller force, led by the northern earls Edwin and Morcar, would watch the approaches to York and the rich lands of Northumbria. It was a calculated risk that acknowledged the harsh reality of England's strategic position. But Harold had not counted on the treachery that ran like poison through the veins of his own family. Tostig, burning with humiliation and rage, had spent months moving between the courts of Europe, seeking allies in his war against his brother. His journey had taken him from Flanders to Denmark, from Scotland to Norway, carrying with him detailed knowledge of English defences and the bitter determination of a man who had lost everything. When Tostig finally stood before Harald Hardrada in his great hall, the meeting was electric with possibility. Here was the local knowledge the Norwegian king needed, combined with the legitimacy of an English claimant seeking to reclaim his birthright. Tostig painted a picture of a kingdom ripe for conquest, its defences stretched thin, and its people weary of Harold's rule. The northern earls, he claimed, were weak and inexperienced. York would fall within days, opening the road to the rich lands of the south. Harald Hardrada listened with the calculating mind of a veteran warrior. He had fought in more campaigns than most men could count, from rivers of Russia. He understood the deserts of the Holy Land to the frozen value of good intelligence and local support. When Tostig finished his presentation, the giant king's decision was swift and final. Norway would strike first. Before William could launch his own invasion, before Harold could concentrate his scattered forces, the last great Viking raid was about to begin. The Norwegian fleet set sail in early September, their dragon prows cutting through the grey waters of the North Sea like knives through silk. Harald Hardrada stood at the bow of his flagship, his long hair streaming in the salt wind, his eyes fixed on the distant coastline of England. Behind him stretched a forest of masts and sails, carrying the flower of Norwegian manhood toward their destiny. The king's banner, the landwaster, snapped and fluttered in the breeze, its raven design seeming to take flight against the stormy sky. As the fleet approached the English coast, fishermen fled in terror, spreading word of the approaching doom. Village bells rang out across Yorkshire, their bronze voices carrying warnings of fire and sword. The last great Viking invasion had begun, and England trembled before the storm. The dragon ships swept up the river Humber like harbingers of apocalypse, their carved prows cutting through the murky waters as if the very gates of Valhalla had opened to release the dead. The sight was one that would haunt the memories of those who witnessed it. Hundreds of vessels, their sails billowing with the wind of conquest, carrying within their hulls the most fearsome warriors the northern world had ever produced. At their head sailed Harald Hardrada, the thunderbolt of the north, his massive frame silhouetted against the grey September sky like a figure from legend itself. The Norwegian king had chosen his landing spot with the cunning of a master strategist. The Humber estuary provided deep water for his fleet and direct access to the heart of northern England. From here, his forces could strike at York, the jewel of the north, while remaining close enough to their ships for a swift escape if fortune turned against them. But Harold had not come to England planning retreat. He had come to conquer or die, and every man in his fleet knew it. The first English blood was spilled at the mouth of the river, where a small flotilla of local vessels attempted to block the Norwegian advance. It was a brave but futile gesture. The English boats, designed for fishing and coastal trading, were no match for the sleek war machines of the north. Viking axes bit through English shields like kindling, and the waters ran red with the blood of men who died defending their homeland. The survivors fled upriver, carrying word of the approaching storm to the towns and villages that lay in Harold's path. As the Norwegian fleet advanced inland, the true scale of the invasion became clear. This was no mere raid, no quick strike for plunder and glory. Harold had brought an army equipped for conquest, complete with siege engines, supplies for a long campaign, and most importantly, the absolute conviction that England would be his before the year was out. His warriors sang as they rode, ancient war songs that had echoed across battlefields from Stamford Bridge to Constantinople. The sound drifted across the water like a promise of violence, a warning to any who would dare stand in their path. The first major settlement to feel the weight of Norwegian steel was the trading port of Rickhall, where Harold established his base of operations. The town fell without resistance, its defenders fleeing rather than face the legendary ferocity of Viking warriors. From Rickhall, scouting parties spread out across the Yorkshire countryside, gathering intelligence and striking terror into the hearts of the local population. Smoke rose from burning farms and villages, black columns that marked the advance of the Norwegian army like funeral pyres against the autumn sky. Word of the invasion reached York within hours, carried by exhausted messengers who had ridden their horses to death in their haste to bring warning. The great city, second only to London in importance, erupted in panic as its citizens realized the magnitude of the threat bearing down upon them. The northern earls, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, found themselves facing the nightmare scenario every medieval commander dreaded: a surprise attack by a superior force with no time to prepare adequate defenses. But the earls were not without courage, and they understood the stakes. If York fell without a fight, the entire north would collapse like a house of cards. Harald Hardrada would have a secure base from which to launch his conquest of the rest of England, and King Harold would face the impossible task of dislodging an entrenched enemy from the strongest fortified position in northern England. The decision was made with grim determination. They would meet the Norwegians in open battle, regardless of the odds. The two armies converged at Fulford Gate, just south of York, on September 20th. The field chosen for battle was a stretch of flat ground bordered by marshes and the River Ouse, terrain that would channel the fighting into a brutal head-to-head collision. The English forces, numbering perhaps 4,000 men, took their position with the river at their backs and the marshes protecting their flanks. It was a defensive position born of desperation, offering no room for retreat but providing some protection against being outflanked by superior numbers. Across the field, Harald Hardrada deployed his forces with the precision of a master tactician, His Norwegian veterans formed the center, their round shields locked together in the traditional shield wall, their long spears bristling like the quills of some monstrous hedgehog. On the flanks, Danish and Swedish allies prepared for the flanking movements that would decide the battle's outcome. The giant king himself took position in the front rank, his presence alone worth 100 ordinary warriors. The battle began at dawn with the haunting sound of war horns echoing across the Yorkshire countryside. The English charged first, their battle cries mixing with the clash of steel as they hurled themselves against the Norwegian line. For a moment, it seemed as though courage and desperation might triumph over numbers and experience. The shield walls met with a crash that could be heard for miles, and men fell like wheat before the scythe as axes and spears found their marks. But Harald Hardrada had not conquered half the known world by allowing his enemies to dictate the terms of battle. As the English pressed their attack, Norwegian flanking forces moved through the marshes, using their knowledge of such terrain gained from countless campaigns in similar ground. The trap closed with devastating efficiency. English warriors who had been pushing forward suddenly found enemies attacking from their sides and rear. The ordered battle line dissolved into chaos as men fought desperately to avoid encirclement. Earl Edwin fell early, struck down by a Norwegian axe as he tried to rally his men. Earl Morcar fought on with the fury of desperation, but his forces were crumbling around him. The marshes that had seemed like protection now became death traps, as fleeing English soldiers found themselves trapped in the boggy ground, easy prey for pursuing Vikings. The slaughter was terrible to behold, a massacre that left the cream of northern English nobility dead in the mud of Yorkshire. When the sun set on September 20th, Harald Hardrada stood victorious on a field carpeted with English dead. His banner, the Landwaster, flew triumphant over a scene of devastation that would be remembered for generations. York lay open before him, its defenses shattered and its protectors dead or fled. The great Viking's gamble had paid off spectacularly. He had achieved in a single day what many had thought impossible: the complete destruction of organized resistance in northern England. The Norwegian king's victory sent shockwaves throughout the realm. In London, King Harold received the news with the stoic calm of a man who had always known this day would come. His brother Tostig's betrayal was now complete. The northern defenses he had relied upon were in ruins, and the most dangerous warrior in Europe stood poised to march south and claim the crown of England. The strategic situation had shifted dramatically in a single afternoon of bloodshed, but Harald Hardrada, for all his tactical brilliance, made a crucial error in the aftermath of his triumph. Intoxicated by victory and confident that no English force could challenge him, he allowed his army to disperse across the Yorkshire countryside. Many of his warriors returned to their ships at Rickle, eager to secure their share of plunder and rest after the brutal fighting. Others occupied York itself, enjoying the fruits of conquest and the adulation of a population too terrified to resist. This dispersion of force would prove to be the Norwegian king's fatal mistake. For even as he celebrated his victory, Harold Godwinson was already marching north with the largest army he could muster. The English king had received word of Fulford Gate within days of the battle, and his response was swift and decisive. Abandoning his vigil on the southern coast, he gambled everything on a lightning campaign to destroy the Norwegian threat before William of Normandy could launch his own invasion. The march north was one of the most remarkable feats of medieval military logistics. Harold's army covered nearly 200 miles in just 4 days, a pace that would challenge modern soldiers with mechanized transport. The king drove his men relentlessly, allowing only the briefest stops for rest and food. Word spread ahead of them as they moved, carried by mounted messengers who rallied local militias to join the royal standard. By the time Harold approached York, his force had swollen to perhaps 7,000 men, the largest English army assembled in decades. The speed of Harold's advance caught the Norwegians completely off guard. Harald Hardrada had expected weeks of warning before any English response could threaten his position. Instead, he found himself facing an enemy army that had materialized as if by magic, appearing outside York before his scattered forces could be recalled and organized. The giant king's composure finally cracked as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. The hunter had become the hunted, and the trap was already closing around him. And so the stage was set for the final act of this extraordinary drama. At Stamford Bridge on September 25th, the last great Viking king would meet his destiny in a battle that would close forever the age of northern raids. Harald Hardrada, the thunderbolt of the north, would fall with an arrow in his throat, his dreams of conquest dying with him in the Yorkshire mud. Harold Godwinson would win his greatest victory, proving that English steel could still triumph over foreign ambition. But victory came at a terrible price. Harold's exhausted army had barely time to bury their dead before word arrived that William of Normandy had landed at Pevensey. The wheel of fate turned once more, and the English king who had saved his realm from Viking conquest now faced his greatest test. At Hastings, on October 14th, the destiny of England would finally be decided not by oaths or promises, but by sword and shield, by Norman cavalry and English axes. When the sun set on that fateful day, Harold Godwinson lay dead upon the field, an arrow through his eye and his kingdom lost forever. William the Conqueror had claimed his prize at last, and England would never be the same. From the ashes of Anglo-Saxon defeat rose a new nation, forged by Norman ambition and tempered by English resilience. The England we know today was born in the blood and fire of 1066, shaped by the collision of three worlds and the destiny of one extraordinary Norman duke.